So I played this game more than a year ago called Lisa the Painful RPG. It was one of the few games I've played that really stuck with me, and it was an experience I found myself really wanting to talk about, or more accurately, incoherently yap about on the internet. So in the span of a few weeks, I ended up compiling what I wanted to say about Lisa the Painful RPG into a Word document, and I edited and messily threw together this video about it, which I named Lisa the Painful RPG. Granted, it's not the most creative name for a video, but it was my first, so you gotta give me some slack. At least in my next video, I came up with a better title. No, I didn't. I'm just a liar. For every video I've made since then, I've just kept the same formula that Lisa had. Grease the Grief RPG, Night Reverie, the Wishful RPG, Far From Noise, the Balancing RPG, To the Moon, the Retrospective RPG, and so on. And I do this mostly because I'm just uncreative and lazy. But it's a silly gimmick which I will probably continue to do as it's familiar and it works. I think you can take just about any game followed by an adjective or just a word that best describes it and slap RPG at the end and it would make sense. But realistically, I don't really know how many games I've played and how many I will play that are considered RPGs. The genre RPG in video games always confuses me, because if I Google RPG, not that one, it's basically described in the literal sense of role-playing game, where you take on the role of a character in a fictional world. But that sounds like basically every game I've played. I mean, I look at this Reddit post from 6 years ago. Isn't every game an RPG because we're playing the role of the main character? And I totally agree with that. What game do you play that's not an RPG? Scrabble? Never mind, you got us there. Okay, so there's a lot of games that I wouldn't call an RPG, but I still don't get how at least all story-driven games are, when you take the role of the main character progressing the story in a fictional world. And I see people argue things like it has to be a game that has RPG elements, like a leveling system, or turn-based combat, or an in-depth party system. But then again, I've played a game called One Shot that doesn't have any of that, yet it was made in a game engine called RPG Maker. So is One Shot an RPG Maker game that's not an RPG because it doesn't have the right qualifications? If RPG Maker doesn't automatically make RPGs, why isn't it just called Maker then? I don't know, I digress, I'm all over the place. But I wanted to rant about that for a little bit because it always bothered me. And I also mention it for a reason, because what I want to truly talk about was something I found on Steam that has a similar issue when it comes to what it's classified as. However, instead of it being argued on whether or not it's considered an RPG, more extremely for some reason, it's argued that this isn't even a video game to begin with.
Crashing clouds, ever-changing shapes that tell a story. I see story out there. Greedy eyes now cry 'cause they forgot to take the greatest prize. And children running when falls behind. I hear her calling. I think she's calling a pretty name that I forgot. I got distracted watching shapes in the clouds. But since we're all just dust in the wind, I'll keep on telling stories that never happened, but maybe that one day will.
Now, I'm not just saying that to create conflict. It's called The Longest Road on Earth, and if you watch the beginning of the trailer for it, the narrator says this.
Some people would say this is not a game. Maybe they'd prefer to call it something else, but if it's not a game, I don't know what it is.
But that's the thing. I don't know what else it would be. Sure, I can go to Google again and find the varying answers it may have to nitpick the definition, like when looking for what an RPG is, but in this case, it shouldn't be that hard to differentiate from other forms of media. I feel like looking at it, everything points to The Longest Road on Earth being a game. I mean, I even bought it on Steam, so I imagined it would be one. But the reviews of this are what changed my expectations for it. On Steam, it's rated as mostly positive at a 77%. The unusual thing about it is that a lot of the positive and negative reviews also agree that this isn't a game. It doesn't feel like a game, yet it is a story and an experience that could be only presented like one. This game is more of an art piece than anything else. A beautiful, artistic experience. I'm not entirely sure how to feel about this game. As others have pointed out, this isn't much of a video game. The Longest Road on Earth isn't really a game, but it's definitely an experience, not a game. This is one of those few artistic experiences. What on earth is the point on this quote-unquote game? A deeply empathetic and human experience.
There is is no game!
I 100% agree, it's an experience. Cool soundtrack and experience. Not really a game, more of an interactive experience. Experience, 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 experience. Well, there you have it, folks. Some things are so good they transcend the mere title of video game and instead become experiences. I mean, almost every positive review calls this an experience. They also love to use the word poignant for some reason when describing this. But I don't know. I don't really like that answer. But so you can decide for yourself, let me just go ahead and talk about this experience. Okay, yeah, no, I'm just gonna call this a game for the rest of the video for simplicity. Saying experience just sounds far too pretentious coming out of my mouth. But playing this game, I can definitely see why such an idea is so widely agreed upon. It's more akin to that of a vintage 1920s projector. This might be an odd analogy, so bear with me. But back, I think a little before 1920, their projectors were not powered by electricity, or more relevantly for the time, mechanical motors. Instead, they were manually powered via hand crank, in which you had to constantly be cranking this old projector for the black and white movie to still be playing. It's also not like I was there at the time, so this is just information from Google. Though if anybody from the 1920s is watching and wants to correct me, feel free. But the gameplay is that you're somewhat mindlessly cranking to keep the story going, which may be in the form of just pressing and holding down one button on your keyboard, or if they really want to be engaging, pressing the same button multiple times in a row, really spices things up. But it's mostly just holding right on your keyboard and moving slowly, then holding left on your keyboard and also moving slowly. But through this cranking, you see the life of multiple characters and their routines as you control them through day-to-day life. If you haven't noticed already, the characters are also represented as anthropomorphic animals. I'll probably be off the mark a little bit with what kind of animal they are, but respectfully, there's this mouse lady, a fox, possibly a raccoon, like I said, I can't really tell, a bird, a bear, and a little moose who we see in their individual short stories shown throughout. There's also an alligator, or crocodile, who works to somewhat connect the stories, though we don't see much of them. The fact that their stories are shown through a black and white lens, just like an old film, also drives home the idea of the vintage 1920s analogy. However, unlike a movie from the 1920s, unless you're playing this on mute for some reason, this game is no silent film.
I said goodbye the other day. Some eyes looked up and said, will you take her? They say move on and that's what I do. But I'm scared to walk this road without you.
While I would love to play their songs as I talk about this, a lot of their original soundtrack is very dependent on listening to the lyrics, and I'd rather not talk over it. Feel free to listen to the full soundtrack on YouTube though. But while going through the dailiness of these characters, a lot of their story is told not through dialogue, but rather visuals and music. The music is composed by Bea, who is one of the developers of the game.
I'm Bea, and I'm in charge of all the music from this game.
She's been a part of other indie titles such as Laika, Aged Through Blood, and another called Friends vs. Friends. Her songs are a core part of The Longest Road on Earth, as her lyrics are highly personal and sentimental, working to convey a certain emotion for each song, an emotion you feel as you traverse the longest road on Earth. The name of the game, however, is very contrarian. Despite it being called the longest road on Earth, it's actually relatively short, being only around 2 hours. However, those 2 hours at times are meant to feel extremely long. It's another reason someone sees this as not a game, but rather a series of music videos, because a few times you're not actively doing anything, but rather just listening to the music. Thankfully, the music is really good, but there are moments where you literally do nothing and just wait. This scene is about a little less than 5 minutes long, but it's just you waiting on a train. And then there's another scene where you wait on a subway. And another scene where you wait for a bus to pick you up. Even when you're not waiting, other tasks you do can be mind-numbingly simple and uninteresting as you watch the lives of these characters fall victim to a bland routine. It's admittedly pretty mundane, but if that's the longest part of this game, you may be wondering when the road part of it comes into play. And, well, there isn't really a road, or at least there's no physical one that the game centers around. Instead, it's rather metaphorical, with the longest road on Earth simply being life. Life may be short, but it's the longest thing we'll ever do, and it's the longest road we'll ever traverse. Even when it shows the dull and boring parts of just waiting around, that's life too. For me, ever since school started back up, it feels like a decent chunk of my life has consisted of those dull and boring parts, as I've spent a lot of time just waiting. Even during break when I had not much to do, ultimately I was waiting for school to start back up. With that being said, as someone who has very limited free time due to my education taking up a majority of my days at the moment, honestly, why would I spend my time playing a game about the tedious and monotonous parts of life? I'm already living those parts, why would I spend another second playing it? Because, honestly, Besides me seemingly bad-mouthing the mundane parts of this game, it is still beautiful. Not only musically, as I must reiterate how nice the soundtrack is, but also visually. Despite it being colorless and shown to give a very somber tone, it still shows life. I know I keep throwing around the word life, and it may seem I'm doing that so I don't have to go into more detail, but I don't know how else to put it. It isn't something I can so easily describe in words. That's what this experience is for. Now, with how unexciting I've made this out to be, it's kind of depressing to think that this may be all life is. It may seem I'm trying to paint life in a very pessimistic way, showing how life is nothing but a soulless routine. However, even when there are admittedly mundane parts, not all of it is. I think at least 80% of this experience is pretty gloomy, but it makes the short, hopeful moments that much more impactful, and the simple, small joys that much more memorable. Especially in the last chapter of this experience, we see the life of a young kid, and while it is still depressingly gray, it's shot in a very whimsical and imaginative way. Compared to the previous chapters, instead of mindlessly doing janitorial work, you're playing with toys. Instead of waiting on a bus for your soul-draining 9 to 5, you're riding a sled down a hill. Instead of mindlessly doing paperwork, you're drawing for fun. Instead of riding a bike to get somewhere, you're running with everything you got just because you can. And even when it still brings you back to reality in the end, it doesn't make those pleasant moments any less pleasant, because it's both the long and boring things and the little joyful things that really accumulate and make us human. While I guess these characters aren't technically human, their similar routines and individual fleeting moments does wonders to present a sense of shared humanity, despite each story being different. Or at least that's my messy interpretation. I don't know if all I said about this experience was right or not, because it has no dialogue, but this being left open to interpretation only gives more reason for you to play this game yourself, or play this experience for yourself, or whatever. I don't care if this is or isn't a video game, just as much as I don't care whether or not every game I've played is an RPG, because this is something special, and something as trivial as what it's classified as doesn't change that fact, that even if you don't want to consume this type of medium of storytelling, and it may not be for everyone, to those it is for, this is truly a beautiful game experience.